So, hello everyone, and welcome to our launch webinar for our CPACE Embodied Carbon Policy Primer. Really glad to have folks joining us today, and I see lots of familiar names. Um, my name is Ari Bukauskas. I'm a manager here on the Embodied Carbon team within the Carbon Free Buildings program at RMI. I'm recovering from a cold today, so I'm going to stay off video. So this will be kind of a bit of a narrated slideshow and conversation with folks. And we've got a Q&A, the functionality turned on today. So um, if anyone has questions or comments or anything that they'd like to for us to cover today, please feel free at any time to drop your thoughts into the Q&A. And I've got help here from Matt on our comms team who will help us make sure that we get to everyone's questions. Um, so with that, I'll dive in. And we'll just start with a quick intro to embodied carbon in CPACE. And just because we've got a larger group today and a pretty broad diversity, I'll spend a little bit of time just introducing CPACE for those who may not be familiar, and a little bit of time introducing embodied carbon for those who may not be familiar. Um, and then we'll chat about the primer itself, run through what we've introduced in that document. And then we'll have some time at the end to field questions and comments from folks. So, what is CPACE? So, CPACE is a group of state-authorized financing programs that enable financing for building decarbonization and other eligible public benefit improvements. So, water conservation, resilience, seismic upgrades, and they're repaid through a special assessment on property taxes. Um, some features of this type of financing is that it runs with the property, so to speak. It's repaid via this special assessment. It's senior to other commercial real estate debt, and it's often long-term and fully amortizing. So uh, for those folks who are not deep in the world of commercial real estate financing, really the end result here is that CPACE is a vehicle for offering competitive long-term financing, which makes it cheaper to make upgrades to buildings, and especially for our purposes, make upgrades to buildings that reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So there are 35 CPACE programs around the country. And within those programs, we've seen a pretty exponential growth in uptake. So on the left here, we have cumulative transaction volume using CPACE, which is showing that we've got around $10 billion invested so far, and hopefully much more soon. And although we've got this great uptake in CPACE growing, we also have seen that, the primary conventional measures that we see CPACE investments being applied to, that is energy efficiency, um, we see that the opportunity to do better than the basic requirements in code is kind of getting smaller actually over time. We're seeing that it's harder and harder to get that extra reduction in carbon. So a lot of folks, would like to see where are the places that we could use CPACE financing to drive building decarbonization that maybe we haven't yet considered in these programs. And that's where embodied carbon comes in. So we like to say that embodied carbon is the other half, so to speak, of building impact. So we've got our operational impacts, which everyone is, I'm sure, familiar with. So the energy that we use to heat and cool, light, operate our buildings. Embodied carbon, on the other hand, is the emissions associated with the materials and components of our buildings. So everything all the energy and emissions associated with extracting, processing, manufacturing, transporting, installing, and servicing those materials and components. um, making it a huge unaddressed opportunity for CPACE. And just to put some numbers to that, depending on how efficient your building is, out to a 30-year time horizon, embodied carbon can make up over half of the building impacts and sometimes more. So it's a really substantial part of the pie, so to speak. Um, and uh, that makes it a really key opportunity for CPACE. And just to put some numbers to the costs associated with reducing embodied carbon, um, what we've seen in past studies is that we're actually able to achieve really substantial reductions in embodied carbon at relatively low cost premiums, which is super exciting. And that means that a tool like CPACE, where we can drive overall reductions in the cost of capital of a building, that is the cost of the debt associated with that building, um, those can have meaningful impacts on the opportunity to reduce embodied carbon, which, as we know, is a really substantial proportion of total emissions. So, broadly speaking, incorporating embodied carbon into CPACE is relatively straightforward. As with operational energy, we have existing standards and policies to build on. And we also know that because of the way that CPACE is structured, as this sort of family of related programs around the country, well, that the CPACE community will need to really work together to ensure that we are maximizing the benefits of the design of our statutes and guidelines to make sure that these are harmonized across geographies, that they're future-proof, that they're right-sized, evidence-backed, and market-ready. And that's why, in particular for CPACE, this really must be a community effort. So to that end, we've convened over the past year a cohort of CPACE experts from all across the industry who've joined us in conversations, provided feedback on draft documents to try to develop and ultimately to disseminate what we are finding to be best practices for integrating embodied carbon into CPACE programs nationwide. And more broadly, our broader aim with this has been to kind of foster a learning community that allows us to share insights from between programs as program administrators, policymakers, developers, technical consultants look to learn from each other as we all kind of embark on this journey of embodied carbon and CPACE. So we had three strategic discussions last year. So thanks so much all to the folks who were able to join us last year for that. And we have now published our CPACE embodied carbon policy primer. So if you haven't had a chance to download that from the website, it's online and free to download and available to check out. And this is a concise policy document aimed at program administrators, state legislators, and anyone ultimately using embodied carbon and CPACE deals, transactions to reference. So I just pulled out here a little bit of our selected feedback from our conversations with folks last year. So what we heard from you all was that really we want to understand what's the cost benefit associated with these embodied carbon investments. Do we have the embodied carbon data? Can we adjust that data so that it's catered to each program dynamically? Can we reward data collection as well as global warming potential reductions? And then can we provide a clear methodology for making these assessments? And can be aligned with existing rules that are out there, whether it's buy clean policies or codes or other standards. And above all, can we have an efficient process for doing this? Going through this paperwork is always going to be a challenge and an extra lift for developers. So we want to really make sure that the program guidance and the review process is as streamlined as possible so that we're not unnecessarily inhibiting transactions and folks accessing this resource. So, as I mentioned before, the primer is about 17 pages. Recommend you download it and check it out. We're going to go through it right now. And we've, in that primer, kind of attempted to address really all of that feedback, acknowledging that we're going to need to obviously continue to answer more questions over time and update the recommendations in future as well. But as a first start for us to get something out to the community, we're pretty excited about this. Um, awesome. And the link to that is in the chat. Thanks, Matt. Um, So great. So let's start from statutes. So we had some conversations last year with folks about, to what extent is CPACE, are CPACE statutes already able to support embodied carbon within them? It's a little bit of a complex question in some states, depending on how the enabling statutes are drafted and what the specific language is. That may be possible. It's going to be very case by case. Broadly speaking, our recommendation is that when the opportunity arises, a statute amendment is kind of the gold standard way to get embodied carbon built into your program. So the statute amendment actually can be really concise and quite simple and broadly inclusive of all the embodied carbon improvements that we'd envision taking place on commercial buildings in future. Um, So the way that we frame this language is intended to be very inclusive in that way. So any measure that reduces the total greenhouse gas emissions associated with the extraction, manufacturing, etc., of a building's materials and components. The details of exactly how to determine, what measures are eligible, how to measure that all we feel should be handled in program guidelines. Reason being that statutes take a lot of work to get passed, and markets evolve, the science evolves, and it's much easier to make corrections and updates in program guidelines to match the current market realities than it is to go back and try to get a further amendment on statute. So really the goal of the statute amendment is to establish the basic intent here of including embodied carbon as an eligible improvement within programs. So moving on to guidelines, program guidelines, we really see Oops, sorry, folks. We really see three compliance pathways within program guidelines for CPACE. One of these is a material pathway. The second is taking a whole building view, and the third, which we've not included in this primer, but I know folks that are probably on this call are working on with us potentially, is on adaptive reuse. So today I'll just chat about the material and whole building pathways in depth, and also happy to chat with folks about the adaptive reuse pathway as well in future. So the material pathway is actually really straightforward. So for any material in a building that we've got the data for in the list provided in the primer, what we can set in the program guidelines is a threshold to say that the global warming potential, that is the kilograms of CO2 equivalent per unit of that material, can be no greater than a certain number. If the GWP is below that number, the costs of procuring that material are eligible for CPACE financing. And the way that we've approached the kind of dynamic aspect of this is to suggest really that administrators apply factors to the basic values that we've provided in the table in the primer. So this is just ready mix concrete pulled out, but we've got values for all of these different materials. And these are pulled from Carbon Leadership Forum's Material Baselines report. So they represent aggregated data from around the US on all of these product materials and building products, which give us these GWP target values. Um, so the these values really we see as a starting point. For programs that are looking to get a program off the ground, you can absolutely start with these values. And depending on the level of ambition that you're seeking for the program and the local market context, you can apply an adjustment factor to those values. In places where you have more availability of low embodied carbon materials, you can have a higher ambition factor, or you can reference data that is available locally to adjust those factors. In areas where data is less available or materials are less available, you can be a little bit lower ambition. Um, and I think just speaking to the ethos of this, particularly at the early stage of embodied carbon and CPACE, we really just want to see folks utilizing these benefits and utilizing the program. So, generally the recommendation um, that we tend to make is, start with a low ambition pathway, and um, once folks are clearly utilizing the benefit and you've got deals and transactions going through the program, you can always increase ambition over time, which is part of the benefit of building these into program guidelines rather than statutes. So I'm just going to see. So Sue's got a question here. For concrete in particular, do you see the use of regional GWP values from NRMCA rather than national averages from CLF? It's a great question, Sue. I actually recommend that folks, if would that you can use those regional averages. We've provided the national averages here to some extent for brevity, um, but the regional averages would also be appropriate, if not slightly better for that purpose. There's also, with regards to how you applied these adjustment factors. This is a relatively simple way to apply these adjustment factors. For some materials, say ready-mix concrete, we actually have enough data to be able to provide like a statistically informed adjustment factor. So you can say based on the known variance of the GWP values in a given region of your concrete emissions, um, you can apply a percentile based adjustment factor. So it's a great question, and would encourage folks to utilize the GWP values that best represent their local market conditions, and the NRMCA regional averages are a great source of that. So if that doesn't come up in a Google search and you'd like to get access to that data, please do reach out to me and I'd be happy to point folks in that direction. Great. So moving on to the whole building pathway. So whereas the material pathway really just looked at replacing individual materials in a building, the whole building pathway is taking the whole building lens. So we're saying, let's count up the overall embodied carbon of the entire building, and compare that to what we know are reasonable numbers for the whole building embodied carbon of that building type. And that overall measure of embodied carbon is what we call embodied carbon intensity. So that is the kilograms of CO2 equivalent per meter squared of gross internal floor area. Um, and I'll just expand that here for folks so you can see that. Um, and what's important to note is that there's a physical scope boundary, a definition of the scope over which that calculation is performed. Um, Typically, what we've seen for LEED and for other standards for embodied carbon whole building assessments is that structure and enclosure are considered to be the physical scope boundary. So everything that's holding the building up, and then everything in the wall assembly from the exterior through to the interior excluding the interior finishes, should be included in the scope of that assessment. Um, so when you've got your ECI calculated for your building, this is something that a developer and with the help of a technical consultant should be able to do without too much difficulty. They're able to compare this against the target values. So this is a data set from the CLF, and shout out to the CLF folks who might be on this call who helped us prepare these values. Um, this tells you for a particular type of building, um, what your ECI must be in order to be eligible for CPACE financing. And we've provided here three ambition levels. So if you know you as your program has you're not seeing a lot of a lot of interest or kind of sophistication around embodied carbon in your geography, or the materials aren't available in the geography, you can absolutely, and we do absolutely recommend starting with a low ambition pathway, and then increasing that over time in subsequent program guideline updates. And what I'll just say about the whole building pathway is that, whereas the material pathway really rewards, that relatively simple action of switching to a low carbon material, the great thing about the whole building pathway is that it really opens up a whole array of opportunities for developers to reduce embodied carbon, which might also include directing their structural engineer to pursue efficiency improvements by adjusting the column grid spacing or adjusting the floor system design so that you're using less concrete, less steel overall. And it's worth noting that those kinds of investments in integrative design and optimization can actually reduce the overall cost of the building. So that the whole building pathway actually, in some ways, involves a little bit more analysis, but it could actually end up being a cheaper way to achieve deeper embodied carbon reductions. So I'll just briefly chat about kind of a number of administrative considerations which are relevant here. So eligible costs. Um, Obviously, hard costs associated with the purchase and installation of low embodied carbon structure and enclosure materials would be considered eligible. And then all of the soft costs associated with design, procurement, optimization, data collection, data handling um, for that embodied carbon design and submission process would be considered eligible as well. And then for financing terms, the approach that we've kind of recommended here for embodied carbon is for structure elements, because these are essentially going to last for the full service life of the building, except in very rare instances. The recommendation would be to the financing term would be the lesser of the estimated remaining service life or and the maximum financing term that's allowed by statute. For enclosure elements, the default here would be 30 years, or the estimated service life, or the maximum financing term. And of course, if there are elements that are known to have shorter service lives, those should be handled with non-default values, and that should be handled in the submission. Um, Savings investment ratio. So for the for the CPACE nerds among us, this will obviously be quite familiar. For those who may not be CPACE experts, excuse me, savings investment ratio is essentially a requirement to demonstrate that any investments made using CPACE will pay for themselves. And this is a reflection of kind of operational energy efficiency improvements that historically would have resulted in these utility cost savings, and could be relatively straightforwardly calculated within that framework. The truth is with embodied carbon investments is that they're a little bit trickier. It's a little bit trickier to do the full cash flow analysis associated with these. Um, so what we recommend is that generally that CPACE programs, where possible, exempt embodied carbon from these requirements. Um, and happy to get into the specifics of this in more detail. But we've done some of this modeling where we have some cash flow models that can kind of look to the future and estimate various means of recovering value from embodied carbon investments. Um, Generally speaking, the recommendation here is that if the market will accept these improvements, that they should be allowed to do that, and we kind of want to reduce barriers to that by strict requirements for making these savings to investment ratio calculations. And then lastly, financing limits. Um, Broadly and kind of qualitatively here. With embodied carbon, we're actually introducing a potentially quite large new source of C-based financing for a project. And to reflect, that deeper level of decarbonization, that larger investment in decarbonizing a property by accessing this whole new bucket, the other half of building emissions, so to speak. Um, we suggest where feasible, and appropriate within statutory limits to, reward that by increasing financing limits to allow greater proceeds in those instances. And lastly, just a few points kind of for future and kind of future updates for the primer. I mentioned adaptive reuse pathways, so developing pathways for rewarding adaptive reuse, we see as a really important lever for embodied carbon. We had a question about regional benchmarks. Would definitely encourage any folks who are in the process of developing either statute updates or program guidelines to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to provide any resources to support that. Uh, Also happy to support on SIR guidance where that's necessary, in statute or otherwise. Excuse me. And and then MEP data just kind of being another one of those categories where we're starting to see enough data potentially to include within that physical scope boundary as well. There's probably a number of other areas too where we could expand this work. So really looking forward to engaging with this community in the coming years to continue to refine and improve this guidance. Um, so with that, we can jump into some Q&A from folks. And I think would love to hear, especially certainly from folks who are representing CPA's programs, administrators, policymakers. I know we have a pretty broad diversity of representation here today. So from developers, from technical consultants, even building products manufacturers. Really welcome any questions, thoughts. How does this apply to me? Um, so I'll open up the floor and please do share your thoughts. Thanks. Awesome. Question from Graham on adaptive reuse. So do we have any initial guidance on adaptive reuse projects? Yeah, I think Graham, the the philosophy that I'd take here is that we want to reward adaptive reuse in general because it's just a great for not just for embodied carbon, for many reasons, it's a great thing. It has lots of public benefits. Um, and so for that kind of within that broad ethos, I think limiting any kind of onerous reporting requirements to necessarily, demonstrate that you're eligible. So one thing we've seen in code, for example, with CalGreen, California's green building code, is they have a reuse pathway in that for their embodied carbon, which essentially is that if a project reuses a certain percentage of the existing building, it's compliant. Um, the question becomes, uh, to sort of what extent of that project should be eligible in the context of a voluntary incentive program. So, for a code compliance purposes, being compliant with the code simply by reusing a certain proportion of your building makes a ton of sense. I think the questions that I have and I'd like to understand better is in the context of this voluntary financing incentive program, how do we ensure that how do we calibrate that sort of reward? Because theoretically, any retrofit project would comply with that minimum percentage of reuse of an existing building. And the question then becomes, do we want to make every one of those projects eligible for all of their costs to be CPACE financeable, or do we want to have some other test? And um, I honestly actually haven't really thought deeply enough about that to have a solid answer. So I really would love to hear more from folks in this community if you have thoughts about that. We certainly are beginning to chat about that with certain programs. So that's a great question, Graham. Thanks. Um, Steph asks, are there regulatory, legislative, or policy barriers that limit CPACE in certain markets, such as California? If so, what needs to be done to allow CPACE in these markets? Um, I believe CPACE is active in California. I'm less familiar with that program. So um, so CPACE is enabled. For folks who aren't the CPACE nerds on the call, CPACE is enabled through a state law, and then programs are administered via an administrative body within that state. In some states, it might be the Economic Development Authority. In others, it's the Energy Office. It kind of varies state by state, but it's enabled by state statute. So, if we're talking about, what are the limits to allowing CPACE in markets in general, the only limit really is, has that state passed a CPACE enabling statute? And as we can see from this map, much of the United States has already done that. And this represents, I would have to think of really the vast majority of U.S. commercial real estate in terms of like jurisdictional coverage. So does that answer your question, Steph? Was there anything else there that you wanted to follow up on? Great. Sounds like that answered that. Thanks, Steph. While we're while I'm waiting for any other questions, just wanted to name, and maybe I do see a few folks here, some technical consultants on this call. I think we're at this phase now with CPACE where, with embodied carbon and CPACE, where it's really about these enabling statutes, these program guideline updates, and I'm pleased to share that in Colorado we'll have the first live embodied carbon in CPACE program guidelines going live in a few months' time. And we've got some great projects already potentially coming down the pike in DC and other jurisdictions. So um, we've got some of that coming soon. One thing I'll just name is that, the next phase in this work, I think, is really enabling and supporting developers, technical consultants, deal teams on these projects to really doing the kind of financial math and accessing this. So that's something which I'm really excited to dive into, hopefully this year and next, is to provide that support as well. So if any folks have from those groups had questions or thoughts about kind of the next phase of this, would love to hear from you all. Michelle Lambert asks, do we have any insights to share about the process of successfully getting this adopted in Colorado? It's a great question, and we have a few folks on the call today from NRDC. Dharma, Santos Santiago, and Mikhail Haramati led the legislative effort at NRDC to get SB 182 passed. So SB 182 was the statute amendment in Colorado that officially incorporated embodied carbon into the CPACE statute there. So that Mikhail and Dharma can probably speak to in a little bit more detail about the legislative process with that statute update. Um, since the passage of that earlier this year, we've been Mikhail and Dharma and I have been working with the Colorado Energy Office to get those get the program guidelines updated to reflect SB 182. So um, the I think the early lessons from that process are that it's really valuable to have feedback and input from the program administrators to understand the contexts of their specific program. All these programs are slightly different, and there are, certain constraints and considerations that apply in each program that are a little bit unique to those. That said, I think what's really helped, and Michelle, thanks so much to your team for this, is really showing up with the data, particularly around these GWP values, and coming in with a bit of a template, which is kind of what this primer aims to provide, a bit of a template of how, broadly speaking, we hope to actually implement this in the guidelines. And that template, for the time being, is those two pathways. It's the material pathway and it's the whole building pathway. So I think that process has gone really well, and maybe Eric and others are on the call today. Um, and we obviously can't have them. There's no audio feature here, but I think they would absolutely be happy to share about that. We will be launching a webinar with them, with the Colorado Energy Office, I believe in April, to speak to that process, to share those updates, and we'd be happy to share about that. So yeah, broadly speaking, I think it's gone really well, and we are soliciting feedback from folks in the space on our draft guidelines, and really excited to see that go live. As to our knowledge, the first uh, program guideline, sort of full statute to program guideline implementation that we've seen so far in CPACE in the US. So thanks for that question, Michelle. Great. Um, yeah, any folks want to speak to, I see a lot of folks here who have exciting CPACE projects, and I'm sorry, I keep saying if folks want to speak, I guess you could chat through the Q&A, and I can kind of relay what you'd like to share with the group. But yeah, if anyone would like to offer insights on their experiences. Um, or any follow-up questions. Otherwise, we can wrap up. Um, and um, happy to answer any questions over email if anyone wants to follow up. Um, and yes, the question is, will this be recorded? We do have, yes, we did record today. I should have said that at the top, but we happy to share a recording and slides with folks after the call today. Um, and yeah, really happy to engage with anyone to keep chatting about this topic. I think we're right at the beginning here of this exciting next step, and I'm just seeing a question here. So what have the uh, biggest market concerns slash misperceptions about CPACE been as a financing vehicle for embodied carbon projects? Um, yeah, it's a great question. I think most of the questions that we've gotten to date have sort of just been around, well, first of all, is there a there? Is embodied carbon a large enough piece of the pie, so to speak, to warrant the effort it would take to update our statutes, to update our program guidelines, to incorporate this. And I hope that, what we've shared just in these kind of broad brush description of kind of the size of the pie, and I'll bring up those slides again for reference, um, is that, we do feel that embodied carbon is a really important part of building emissions. And part of the reason why it's taken longer for us to be able to answer, whether in fact it is relevant to consider embodied carbon in buildings is that it just takes a lot of data to be able to answer that question. And big shout out to folks at CLF and others who have participated in building out the ecosystem for embodied carbon over the past decades, really, um, to help us now be at a place where, for all of the building materials that we use in our buildings, um, and all the component processes and materials that go into those, um, to have the data to be able to quantify the climate impact and also many other kinds of environmental impact of those, and then aggregate those into, the overall numbers for our buildings has taken some time for us as an industry to get to, which is why there's been a bit of a lag, so to speak. It's been many decades of energy efficiency in buildings has been a major topic of action and policy and regulation, and embodied carbon kind of only now do we um, have that really robust data set to help us to build that in a similar fashion. So I think that was one barrier, was just helping folks get acquainted to that data, and see the size of the opportunity. And then the second, I think, is just that the mechanics of how to actually build this into the programs, which is really what we aim to address with the primer. The advantage there being that we have these standards to build on, and that with relatively a few tweaks to those existing codes, buy clean policies, etc., that we can build that into CPACE. And it's also taken a fair bit of conversation with folks in the CPACE community to understand, what's going to be fit for purpose within these financing programs. Thinking about things like financing terms, limits, SIR, um, and we still have unanswered questions. I think, really, what is the best way to approach adaptive reuse, etc. So that's why I think this community has been such a great way for us to answer those questions and address any concerns that folks have. Um, so yeah, it's a great question. Ariel asks, regarding the savings to investment ratio recommendations, what are some of the considerations you're weighing when trying to estimate the future value of reducing embodied carbon? Yeah, it's a great question, Ariel. So I think there's a few buckets under which we see kind of the return on investment with embodied carbon. Um, the first bucket is actually right at is even sort of before construction phase, which is to say that a big upfront investment in a robust integrative design process. That is to say, bringing the structural engineers into the room with the architects and the MEP engineers and all the other um, designers and trades on a project to think in an integrated way about how to reduce overall emissions and cost. Has been, that's the message that I've gotten from folks in industry time and again, is that making that investment can result in a big savings, not just in carbon, but potentially in cost. For example, through reducing that material demand. So one bucket is simply to say that compared to a quote unquote business as usual building, if you invest in that design effort, that you will actually see a return in hard cost savings from all the materials that you didn't need to buy. Um, the the second bucket you could categorize as sort of tenant demand um, and really ultimately rental revenues. So there's been some studies from Woodworks and others on mass timber, um, kind of showing that mass timber buildings tend to perform better in terms of occupancy rates, attracting higher rental rates, and mass timber is it reduces embodied carbon in many instances, but it also is it's um it's a market differentiator. So in a down market for offices, mass timber offices seem to have anecdotally performed better with those rental revenues. So that's something that you can build into these models as kind of a second bucket is that, maybe you've got higher occupancy rates and maybe you've got higher rental rates. And then the third bucket, I think, is really around uh, the, and it's a little bit harder to quantify, but is kind of around this compliance and transition risks to kind of broadly lump them all together. Um, Basically, are your business practices going to be future proof in a future environment where we expect to see more embodied carbon regulation and kind of mandatory rules surrounding that? It's a little bit harder to quantify that, but that'd be kind of the third place that we might suggest looking for that value. Um, all that to say, it is a little bit hard to build into a pro forma today, but not impossible. And I think it's always, a pro forma is ultimately it's a financial kind of storytelling tool, and um, the I think what we encourage any project to do their own analysis, to come to their own conclusions, and arrive at their own understanding of where they're going to be seeing that value coming from embodied carbon. So it's a great question. Question here is, are there any case studies, research studies, or other anecdotal support that CPACE investment in EC projects can contribute to higher property values? Seems to me that one key ROI value proposition is the resale value of properties with lower carbon emissions. That's a great point, and I didn't call that out as like a separate bucket here, um, because I guess you could argue that kind of wrapped into that property value assessment is all those other buckets, what your sort of or at least your rental revenue and then future compliance or tenant perception possibly. Um, So I mentioned that Woodworks business case study on mass timber. That's one that I'm aware of. We don't yet have like um, case studies or data sets showing that as a trend. But I think we'd like to be able to collect that kind of data in future. Part of the challenge is that, most of the time embodied carbon improvements will be made alongside a host of other improvements, operational energy efficiency improvements, any other number of other kind of good things to do in a building anyway. Um, so it can be hard to tease out, um, what is the unique contribution of those embodied carbon improvements to the overall property value. And the mass timber one is a little bit easier to draw that connection because it is such a substantial switch. It's kind of an on-off switch. You're either kind of using quite a lot of mass timber or maybe not. And it also has the visual appeal and it has sort of external facing characteristics. Whereas, we don't necessarily have a lot of tenants really looking closely at the embodied carbon values associated maybe with a property that they are leasing. But that we hope and expect that could change in future. So that's a great question. Would love to have that data set. Question is, what is the statutory update, say in California process, like to allow embodied carbon into the CPACE program? Um, yeah, so um, really these statute updates, it's a legislative update, it's a bill, in the same way that any other bill goes through the legislative process. Um, so really it needs sponsors, it needs draft language, go through committee, all that. And our intent with the statute amendment language that we've provided here is that legislators, advocates, folks who are doing this work, can lift this language, essentially put it into their bill text, and then work with the relevant stakeholders to get that through that process. So yeah, same as any bill, and hopefully that because this is a relatively small amendment, it's not necessarily a huge lift. In practice, these are often bundled, I think, with other measures, other state amendments associated maybe with embodied carbon or other related initiatives. So that's something to consider. Um, but yeah, kind of that standard legislative process. That's a great question. Great. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions filtering in. So I will maybe I'll start transitioning us to wrapping up here. So thanks so much again all for logging on. Do check out the primer, do follow up with me. If you'd like to chat more about CPACE in your state. And yeah, looking forward to continuing the conversation. And thanks so much all and have a great rest of your week.